among young British adults would be avoided if cannabis were not consumed. That's what the media said the paper contended. Do we have an alarmist headline?
Yes.
Yeah, we do. Was this news story published prior to the study's publication? Yes, it was. About 3 days prior to the publication, if I recall, when I got the first media call about this. And it said, well, I'd like to see the paper. And I said, sorry, nobody can see the paper. Does the news report lack sufficient context? Most definitely. In fact, there was no study, per se. It was a meta-analysis. The researchers basically culled through a bunch of pre-existing papers. Most of the papers they looked through did not require a clinical diagnosis of mental illness. You'd think if they were talking about psychosis, that they would be looking at studies where people actually had a diagnosis of psychosis. In the 35 papers they looked at, I think only 6 or 7 required an actual clinical diagnosis. The rest were based on people responding to questionnaires and saying things like, are you impulsive? Yes. Do you suffer from social anxiety? Yes. Do you see yourself as a nonconformist? Yes. Well, you must be psychotic. That is what the papers were based on. They highlight this 40% risk. Use marijuana, risk for schizophrenia goes up 40%. Sounds impressive even if it was true. Less than 1% of the world population suffers from schizophrenia. So what's a 40% risk of less than 1%? We're really not talking big numbers, but you wouldn't know that from reading the news report. The authors of the study, they didn't identify a cause and effect relationship. They tried to. They said there wasn't one there. Media didn't report that. And in fact, the investigators said projected trends for schizophrenia incidents have not paralleled trends in cannabis use over time. In which I would say, then what is your point? The news story finally lacks institutional memory. This paper was published in The Lancet in Britain. Nobody even talked about the fact that just 1 year earlier, the nonpartisan Britain Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs looked at all the same studies, and they said that for individuals, quote, the current evidence suggests that at worst, using cannabis increases lifetime risk of developing schizophrenia by 1%. One would think that would have been in one of these stories, but it wasn't reported in any of them. Case study number 2, cannabis bigger risk than cigarettes. This may be, in all the years I've been doing this, the most egregious reporting of an actual study. It was based on the press release. The study came out on a Friday. All these news reports came out on a Tuesday. The media was calling about this the Monday before that Friday. And it was written by some researchers that know how to play the political game. They have an agenda. The press release had a total agenda, and that's why the press release did not reflect what the study said, and that's why the news reports didn't. Smoking a joint is the equivalent to 20 cigarettes. They talk about an epidemic, and they talk about a risk of lung cancer rising about 6 times in heavy marijuana users. I like this final quote at the end. In the near future, we may see an epidemic of lung cancers connected with this new carcinogen. No one had ever heard of marijuana before, I suppose. Do we have all the essential components here? Do we have an alarmist headline? Most certainly. Was it published prior to was the news report published prior to the study coming out? Yes. Did it selectively publicize information? Yes. Here's what you wouldn't know unless you read the study. Lifetime use of marijuana was not associated with any statistically significant increase in lung cancer. The end. That should have been the headline. They did find, the researchers did, they divided marijuana users up into 3 groups. Low use, moderate use, heavy use. The heavy users, all 14 of them in the study, had a 5.7% increased risk of lung cancer compared to people that didn't use marijuana at all. But when you added in all the people who used marijuana in the study, lifetime use had no association. And in fact, that was because the low to moderate users had a lower risk of lung cancer than people who never used marijuana or tobacco at all. Did this lack sufficient context? Oh, certainly. They don't talk about that they only had 21 cases. They don't mention lifetime use had no increased cancer risk. They don't talk about that if you ever used tobacco, you had a 7-fold risk of cancer. So there again, think of the headline. Cannabis, bigger cancer risk than tobacco. When in fact, people who ever used tobacco had a 7-fold risk, and the people who used marijuana, in this case, 1 marijuana cigarette per day for 10 years, had a 5.7 risk. If you compared the heavy marijuana users in this study to the heavy tobacco users, the heavy tobacco users had 24 times the risk, compared to 5.7 for marijuana. Yet go back and remember what the headline was. I'll also mention that if you use alcohol, your risk for association with lung cancer was much higher than 5.7%. That wasn't in the study. And certainly there was no institutional memory, because even the Washington Post, of all places, had reported on May 26, 2006, that the largest study of its kind has unexpectedly concluded that smoking marijuana, even regularly and heavily, does not lead to lung cancer. There were 2,200 people in that study, by the way. Case study number 3, and the final one, marijuana may have heart attack, stroke risk. This was just from a few months ago. Once again, we're looking at Reuters again. This one isn't too bad, and that's why I highlighted it. They say heavy marijuana use can boost blood levels of a particular protein, perhaps raising a person's risk. And then we have a very interesting line buried actually in the study, buried in the news report, that says the study did not look at whether heavy marijuana users actually had heart disease. Well then what are we talking about? Why do we have a headline that says marijuana may have heart attack risk, stroke risk study, and then we admit later, we didn't really look at that? Most, but not all, the essential components are here. Yes, we have an alarmist headline. Was the news story published prior to the study's publication? Of course. Does the news story selectively publicize information? No, I think they are fairly even-handed here. This was reported fairly cautiously by Reuters. They admit that the study didn't look at whether heavy marijuana users actually had heart disease, although if you read the headline, you'd never realize that. They highlighted the fact that they were looking at smokers who averaged 78 to 350 marijuana cigarettes per week. Who are these people? How do they afford that much marijuana per week? But they still want to volunteer to do a NIDA study that probably paid them about $25 a day. And then, believe it or not, this Reuters report actually included input from reformers. My esteemed colleague Bruce Merkin is actually quoted, and I do like this quote, "We're talking about the marijuana equivalent of a guy in the alley clutching a bottle of cheap wine." I hope you did not offend those people in the audience who happen to smoke 350 marijuana cigarettes a week without them.
My apologies if I did.
If you do anything to that level of excess, it may have some untoward effects, and I would agree with that. The news story did lack institutional memory. It did not talk about the fact that about 8 years ago, we had this exact same alarm bell go off. Somebody said, oh, if you smoke marijuana, you may have a heart attack. But then the researcher who did the study claimed that, well, maybe the risk is about 1 in 100,000. You would have thought that would have been the end of the issue, but it wasn't. So, finally, to conclude, we go back to Eric Good, a sociologist from New York, 1975. In writing in Science magazine, he said, tests and experiments purporting to demonstrate the ravages of marijuana consumption received enormous attention from the media, and their findings become accepted as fact by the public. When careful refutations of such research are published, or when the latter findings contradict the original pathological findings, they tend to be ignored and dismissed. At the time, he was writing about findings from a National Institute of Mental Health report, ganja smoking in Jamaica, that some of you might be familiar with, that essentially disproved everything the U.S. federal government had ever said about marijuana. And he was lamenting about the fact that the study was not getting very much media coverage. And to Eric, I say, unfortunately in 2008, how little things have changed. Thank you.